Let's turn to the Euthyphro dialogue, which is a dialogue written by Plato that's supposed to take place immediately before Socrates' trial in Athens in 399 BCE. The dialogue is meant to resolve the question, what is piety or what is holiness? And the two interlocutors or participants in the dialogue are Socrates, who appeared in most of Plato's dialogues, and Euthyphro. Now, the context here is that Euthyphro has decided to bring evidence against his father, supposedly for a wrongful death, and Socrates is asking Euthyphro, well, you clearly have to know the difference between right and wrong if you're confident enough to bring your own family members to trial. So he asks him, what is piety? And throughout the dialogue, Socrates and Euthyphro come up with a number of different answers, none of which, as we'll see, turn out to be all that satisfying according to Socrates. Now, the first answer that's given is Euthyphro says, well, what I'm doing is basically piety. If you want to be pious, you just have to emulate my behavior. And in this particular case, what I'm doing is prosecuting a wrongdoer. If I were to say that I think my father's guilty of something, but I'm going to hide from the authorities, I won't bring evidence against him, then that would be doing something that would be impious. But I am actually willing to go out of my way to prosecute a wrongdoer. That's what being pious is all about. Now, Socrates knows that there's something wrong with this definition right from the get-go. And what he says is, and he gets Euthyphro to understand this, I think, examples are not really definitions. An example is a specific thing, whereas a definition is broader or universal. For example, if I didn't know what a book was, and somebody pointed to a particular book and said, this is book, that wouldn't really help to define the term book for me, because I need to know what all books have in common to know what the term book means. The same thing would apply if I didn't know what a beverage was, or a television, or a car. So in order to know what piety is, we would need to know the nature of not just one single pious action, but what all pious actions have in common. So it may be that Euthyphro is doing something that's right, but we don't know yet because we don't have a definition by which to define rightness or piety. Now we move to what I'll call definition 2, and Socrates says this is a step in the right direction because it's broader than definition 1. Rather than saying piety is what a single person does, piety is now what the gods love. And notice, because this is pretty general, there could be any number of different things that the gods love, from walking people across the street, performing random acts of kindness, paying tithe to a church, participating in some religious ritual, sacrificing an animal to Zeus, and so on. And the inverse would also be true. There would be certain things that the gods would detest or hate, and those things would be impious. However, Socrates knows that Euthyphro accepts the Greek myths, and he also knows that Euthyphro, in accepting those myths, is a polytheist. That is, he believes that there's more than one god. And if you've ever read the Greek myths, you'll know that the gods oftentimes are depicted as disagreeing with one another. So it's pretty easy to imagine a case in which one god may love an action and another will hate it. Hence, the same action could be both holy and unholy at the same time. If, for example, I'm considering whether or not I should prosecute my own father for doing something that I think is wrong, if Zeus loves the idea of me doing that, then that's an action that would be holy or pious, and it's something that I should do. However, if Poseidon is disgusted by this, Poseidon's like, oh, Andrew, you definitely should not do that. Your father is likable to me. I don't want anything to happen to him. Well, then according to that would be a bad action. So what should I do? I mean, the same action, namely prosecuting my father, would be both holy according to Zeus and unholy according to Poseidon. A good definition shouldn't do that. If you have a definition of a car, you shouldn't then look at a car and say, yes, that's both a car and not a car at the same time. A proper definition gives us clarity, gives us objective criteria for defining something. This leads to a third definition, which is really an amended version of definition 2. Because definition 2 fell apart because the gods were perceived to disagree, what they do is they add the term all to the definition to get around the problem of disagreement. If there's anything that all the gods love, then that would be something that would, by definition, be pious or holy. If there's something that they all hate, then that would be something that, by definition, would be impious or unholy. And if there's anything that they disagree upon, it would be neither holy nor unholy. So this definition is supposed to eliminate the problem of disagreement. But then Socrates asks what is probably the most important question in the dialogue, because he wants to know what makes pious things pious. Are they pious because they're loved, or are they loved because they're pious? And at first, that question sounds a little weird, doesn't it? I've designated the sort of two sides to that question in terms of A and B. A says pious things come before love, and B says that love comes before things are pious. So how do we differentiate these two? What do the two things really mean? Well, let's take A first. A says piety precedes love. The reason then that the gods, or a single god if there's only one, love piety or love pious things is because they are pious. There's an objective moral basis for why they command some things rather than others. If A is true, there would be a reason that the gods, or God, if there's only one God, would command some actions while not commanding others. So, as an example, given the nature of an action like rape, God would know that rape is wrong just by its nature, by its definition. And therefore God would always command against performing such an action. God could no more make rape a right or moral action than God could make a squared circle. In the same way that there's nothing in the definition of a circle whereby it could be a square, rape could not be a good action. Genocide or murder could not be good actions. Now, how does B work? Well, B flips the relationship here. It takes the cart and switches it where the horse is, so to speak. Here we have love that comes before piety. Now this means that any action can be made pious or holy so long as it's loved by the gods or by however many divine beings exist. For example, murder, rape, genocide, or kindness, or generosity. All those things will be neither right nor wrong in themselves. They just become right or wrong simply because they're commanded. So, if somebody were to ask you, if you accepted this view, is murder a right action? You would have to say, well, it depends on something. And the natural question would be, what does it depend upon? Well, it depends upon whatever God tells me to do. Sometimes murdering would be good, and sometimes it would be bad. There's nothing in the nature of murder. Not the sadness that happens to murder victims, not the pain and suffering that happens to the person who dies. None of that stuff could be used as a basis for saying that the action was a wrong action. Now, this theory in ethics has a long and illustrious history, and it has a name. Now, Socrates doesn't use this exact terminology in the Euthyphro. This is sort of a later rendition of the same thing that he's talking about. It's called the Divine Command Theory of Ethics, DCTE for short, and it basically says an action is right or wrong only because it is commanded by some divine being, such as a god. Now, Socrates asks Euthyphro whether the gods love the things they love because they love them, or because these things are already pious. And Euthyphro responds that the gods do love these things. They love what they love because these things are already pious. The exchange goes like this. Socrates asks, "And what do you say of piety, Euthyphro? Is not piety, according to your definition, loved by all the gods?" And Euthyphro says, "Yes." And Socrates says, "Because it's pious or holy, or for some other reason?" And Euthyphro says, "No, that is the reason." Socrates, "It is loved because it is holy, not holy because it is loved." And Euthyphro says, "Yes." Now, despite this seeming agreement, towards the end of the dialogue, Euthyphro reverts to his original position, and he once again says that what is pious is simply what is pleasing or lovable to the gods. So he really comes full circle, and he really accepts the divine command theory. Now, Socrates really believes that this is an unconvincing answer, and there are likely several reasons for this that I want to introduce you to right now. Firstly, Socrates is not really sure that the myths are true. He asks Euthyphro as much. "Euthyphro, are you sure that the myths are literally true?" And Euthyphro is pretty sure. Euthyphro is sort of the Greek equivalent of a fundamentalist, a religious fundamentalist. But we might ask whether we have any compelling evidence that a specific set of religious claims, whether we look at Hinduism or Judaism or Christianity or Sikhism or Islam and so on, is actually true. Also, we might notice that even religious believers in the same tradition, like Christianity or Judaism, don't always agree with one another. So if you are going to base religion, or base morality rather, on religion, you have to be pretty confident that your religion is the right religion and that your interpretation of your religion is the right interpretation. And so I think that Socrates could question that. Secondly, people without religious convictions can act morally. You could also invert that, and you could say it's by no means always the case that people who have religious beliefs always act ethically. And if that's the case, perhaps studying ethics does not in and of itself entail or require that one study religion. They might have something to do with each other, they might be connected, but it doesn't necessarily mean that in order to understand ethics, we have to study religion. And a third thing, can a divine will make immoral actions like rape, murder, or genocide morally right? Now, I chose those three examples, rape, murder, genocide, for a reason, because generally speaking, people will say, obviously those things are wrong. Now, Socrates would challenge us to come up with a good reason to condemn all of those kinds of things. In other words, if we think that those things are right, there's got to be some reason, and the reason had better, for Socrates, it better be more than just some divine command or some authority commands us to believe it, because he wouldn't think that that would be really a compelling reason. Now, Socrates does make certain assumptions. First of all, he does assume that there is an objective answer to the question of what we should do. So if you were a moral relativist, if you believed that right and wrong were terms that only referred to a kind of opinion or a kind of fluctuating system of beliefs that people in a society or an individual might have, if you think that these things are no more objective than, say, maybe our taste in food would be, like in the same way somebody might say they don't like anchovies, some people might say that they don't like genocide, but maybe somebody else does, and who's to say that one person is more right than the other, or who's to say one culture or one civilization is more right than the other. If you really believe that, and I should say there are lots of problems with that relativistic theory, but it is a philosophical move that some people have taken. If you believe that, then that would suggest that Socrates is really wrong to think that there is an objectively right answer. Of course, note, Euthyphro also thinks that there is an objective right answer, namely, it's the answer that the gods give. Now, Socrates also assumes that whatever answer we get is going to be something that's rational. It's going to be something that we can at least theoretically grasp. But if morality were simply the product of some mysterious divine will, or however many divine wills there might be, then it could very well be completely arbitrary and not rational at all. It could be the case that killing is right until it's not, or lying is wrong except when it's not, or genocide is right or wrong, depending upon whatever the will is. And Socrates is assuming that morality has to have some objectivity there that would somehow escape this kind of mysterious, arbitrary, divine will that would somehow define it, as the divine command theory suggests. A third point, there's a different way that we could view the issue. Socrates seems to think that morality is either going to be completely dependent upon the divine will or completely independent of it. Now, obviously, if it's completely dependent on the divine will, we've got the divine command theory of ethics, and he's going to say that's problematic. On the other hand, if it's completely independent of the divine, then this oftentimes will make it difficult for religious persons to sort of understand, well, how do morality and religion go together? How does God or some gods fit together with morality? I think there is a third option here we could look at, and that is, if we assume that there is a God, and that, say there's one God, and that God is perfectly moral, perfectly good, most people that certainly I've talked to who identify as having those beliefs, say your average Christian, Muslim, Jew, and so on, would generally say, well, God would never command immoral actions. If they encountered what looked like a divine command that said, I want you to kill lots of innocent people, or I want you to cheat on your spouse, or I want you to commit genocide, then the likely response would be something like, hey, that can't be a command that comes from God, because God's nature is such that God is ultimately moral, and that's the objective basis for morality. God does not have an arbitrary or capricious will. And in that case, of course, you could sort of say, well, morality is not completely dependent upon the divine will in the way that the divine command theory says, because the divine command theory suggests that anything goes as long as God says it's okay, which seems to imply that even something as bad as rape or genocide could be made right, which seems outlandish. But you could at the same time say it's not completely independent of God, because God created everything in the universe, and God is the ultimate standard of morality, and God doesn't change. So that's a possible move that philosophers like Robert Adams, for example, have tried to make in recent years, and that's certainly something that we could also consider. Anyway, as you can probably tell, these sorts of issues started being discussed in the ancient world, and they persist even nowadays. And so I hope you enjoy the Euthyphro dialogue and whatever Platonic dialogues you happen to read in your travels. And let's pick this conversation up again another time.